Was the Second Amendment created to protect the state against the federal government, or the average citizen against the state? My name is Adam Gardner, and hopefully I'll shed a little light on the background of this article and why it has huge implications today as it did when the inception in 1789. I'll be covering the purpose and history of the Second Amendment, the transition of power from the way the Second Amendment was originally written to the way it is today, and the current climate from all of these transitions from the initial inception, and what action it has taken upon us today as a United States citizen. Back in 1789, the Revolutionary War has already passed. The Constitution was written strictly because the states wanted to wield absolute power because we fought against an overarching federal government, for example, the British Empire. We were terrified of having the same kind of one person dominating every single aspect of a new American life. So the reason the Constitution, especially the Second Amendment, was created to allow states to create a militia. And this militia was designed to protect the state. Every state had its own, but to protect a state from a federal government attack coming in and imposing their will. Now, this was the case up until the National Defense Act of 1916. Prior to this act, which is very important because prior to 1916, the states had all the power. The federal government had very little. After the National Defense Act of 1916, it completely flip-flopped. And I'll get to that in a second. Prior to 1916, for example, the Civil War and all the other little instances of attacks back in those days, there were militias that would represent, and they would go to field their soldiers in battle for the name of the state. Going forward now to 1916, this effectively switched when the federal government imposed this National Defense Act of 1916, which thoroughly eradicated the whole purpose of the Second Amendment. From that point on, states were not allowed to completely control their militias. The federal government had all-inclusive power to wield the state's power to fight in foreign wars and whatever the federal government felt was necessary for protection of the nation. This all boils down to, from that act, right after that World War I happened. And what's important about that is 40% of the soldiers that fought in World War I were National Guardsmen, as they were called now after the National Defense Act of 1916. Prior to that, they were known strictly as state militia. The current climate, as we are today, is acts like the most recent Columbia versus Heller in 2008 switched the balance of power from, effectively, from 1916, the power had switched from the state to the federal government. Who was left to fill the void if an overarching state or overarching federal government went into a state and tried to take control? I believe that the Columbia versus Heller incident was a huge advantage to the average citizen to be able to wield and own their own firearms for whatever reason that an attack by the government, whatever government came in, that the average citizen could have the power to stand up and prevent that from happening. So as you can see, the implications of the Second Amendment are so important. They were important then and they're important now. Even though the transition and balance of power has changed, the fact still remains the Second Amendment is a huge component to American life, and I don't feel that it's going to be going away anytime soon. So however your feelings are in the Second Amendment, as I said, it is not going away, and hopefully I shed a little light, especially from someone that is a huge gun proponent as myself, to shed a little light on the background and understanding that the way that we see it today was not the way it was incepted. I hope you get a little understanding of this. I thank you for your time.